The air in the bank was stale, a sterile mix of recycled oxygen, cheap cleaner, and the faint metallic scent of currency. Arthur Pendleton stood hunched over the counter, the smooth, cool laminate pressing into his thin forearms. His knuckles were white where he gripped the receiver of his old flip phone, pressing it hard against his ear, as if proximity could somehow clarify the confusing torrent of words pouring from it. A voice, slick and unervingly calm, was explaining a critical security breach, a compromised account, an urgent transfer needed to a secure federal holding account. The voice used words like protocol and compliance that felt heavy and official, designed to corner him. Behind him, the line grew. A woman in a business suit sighed audibly, tapping her expensive watch. A young man shifted his weight, the crinkle of his grocery bag a small, impatient thunderclap in the tense silence. Arthur could feel their eyes on his back, could feel the heat of their collective annoyance. He was the obstruction, the slow-moving elderly man holding up the world. His hand trembled as he slid his withdrawal slip to the teller, a young woman with a name tag that read Brianna and an expression that was a careful study in professional indifference. "Sir, are you sure about this amount?" she asked, her voice flat. "It's your entire Social Security deposit for the month." The man on the phone spoke faster. "Do not discuss the transaction with bank personnel, Mr. Pendleton. This is a federal matter. They are not cleared for this information. Comply, or your assets will be frozen indefinitely." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. Federal. Frozen. The words were like stones dropped into the placid pool of his quiet life. He nodded mutely to Brianna, his throat too tight to form words. He could only manage a weak, "Yes, please," he watched, his stomach churning, as she counted out the bills. Not for him, but for the transfer. He followed her instructions to the wire transfer station, his movements stiff and clumsy. The man on the phone guided him through the fields on the form, the account number a long, meaningless string of digits. Each number he wrote felt like a betrayal of his own common sense. Yet the pressure from the voice on the phone and the impatience of the line behind him formed a vice, squeezing the reason right out of him. He signed his name, the familiar loops and lines of his signature looking like a stranger's. The transfer was processed. "The funds are now secure, Mr. Pendleton. A confirmation agent will contact you within 72 hours. Do not speak to anyone about this. Thank you for your compliance." The line went dead. The sudden silence was more jarring than the voice had been. Arthur stood there, the dead phone in his hand, the receipt for the wire transfer feeling flimsy and unreal. The woman in the business suit brushed past him with a huff. The world resumed its normal pace, leaving him in a silent, personal vortex of dawning horror. It was gone. All of it. The money for his rent, for his utilities, for the meager groceries he would buy for the next 4 weeks. It had vanished into a string of numbers on a form. He walked out of the bank and into the harsh afternoon sun, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him with a soft whoosh, sealing him out. The walk home was a blur. The familiar cracks in the sidewalk, the overgrown hedge on the corner, the cheerful blue house with the bicycle on the lawn. It was all scenery in a play where he had just forgotten all his lines. Humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, creeping flush that started in his chest and spread to his face, a weight that settled deep in his gut. He was a fool, an old, stupid fool. The chipped ceramic mug felt heavy in Arthur's trembling hands. He'd been sitting at his small kitchen table for over an hour, the cold, untouched tea a dark mirror reflecting the fluorescent light above. The silence in his small house was absolute, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator and the frantic beating of his own heart. He had to call his landlord. The thought was a fresh wave of nausea. Mr. Henderson was not a cruel man, but he was a man of ledgers and deadlines, a man for whom life's messy tragedies were inconvenient variables in a simple equation of rent paid and rent due. Arthur rehearsed the conversation in his head, the words tasting like ash. He would be honest. He would explain the situation, humiliating as it was, and ask for a little time. Surely, after 10 years of perfect, on-time payments, a little grace would be extended. He finally found the courage, his finger hovering over the numbers on his phone before pressing down. The phone rang 3 times before Henderson answered, his voice abrupt. "Henderson, Mr. Henderson, it's Arthur Pendleton. From 214 Oak Street, Arthur. I was just about to call you. The first is tomorrow. I trust the check is in the mail." The question was casual, but it carried the unyielding weight of expectation. Arthur took a shaky breath. "Actually, sir, that's why I'm calling. There's been a situation, a financial issue. I was the victim of a scam, and my rent money—" He trailed off, the shame of it stealing his voice. He heard a sigh on the other end of the line, a sound of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "A scam? Arthur, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've heard every story in the book. The sick aunt, the lost wallet, the car that broke down. A scam is a new one. I'll give you that." The condescension in his tone was a sharp, painful jab. "No, sir, it's the truth," Arthur insisted, his voice cracking. "They pretended to be from the government. They took everything. That's not my problem, Arthur." Henderson's voice was cold now, all pretense of civility gone. "Your personal financial mismanagement is your own affair. The bank doesn't give me a pass on the mortgage payment for this property because a tenant got scammed. Rent is due on the 1st. That's the lease you signed. No exceptions." The words were brutal, efficient, and final. They stripped him of his dignity, reducing his life savings and a moment of terrifying vulnerability to personal financial mismanagement. He was no longer Arthur Pendleton, the quiet veteran who tended his small garden and always paid on time. He was just a liability, a name in a ledger that was about to be highlighted in red. "Please, Mr. Henderson," Arthur whispered, the plea tearing from a place of deep desperation. "Just 2 weeks. I can try to get help from the VA. Maybe a loan from—" "No," Henderson cut him off. "The 1st, or eviction proceedings begin on the 2nd. That's the policy. Have a good evening, Arthur." The line clicked, followed by the dial tone's monotonous drone. Arthur slowly lowered the phone, the plastic cool against his skin. He felt hollowed out, as if Henderson's words had physically scooped out his insides, leaving nothing but a fragile, brittle shell. The system had no memory, no compassion. 10 years of loyalty meant nothing. His lifetime of service to his country meant nothing. In the cold, unforgiving world of transactions and deadlines, his worth had been calculated and found wanting. He was just a failed account, a problem to be solved with a notice and a lock change. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Arthur lowered himself into the worn armchair in the corner of his living room. The fabric was frayed at the arms, and the cushion had long ago molded itself to the exact shape of his body, a silent testament to countless evenings spent in quiet contemplation. The room was dim, the setting sun casting long, sorrowful shadows across the floor. His gaze fell upon the small, polished mahogany display case on the mantelpiece. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, were his medals. A purple heart, its ribbon a stark, regal color. A silver star, its metallic sheen dulled by time. To anyone else, they were symbols of valor, of battlefield glory. To Arthur, they were heavy with memory, each one a marker for a promise kept, a debt paid, a friend lost. He didn't see them as trophies. He saw them as ghosts. His eyes drifted from the case to the framed photograph beside it. Eleanor. Her smile was soft, her eyes full of a light that he hadn't seen in the world since she'd passed 7 years ago. She had been the one who understood the weight of those medals, who knew the stories he never told. She knew that his strength wasn't in the acts that earned him those ribbons, but in the quiet endurance that followed. He closed his eyes, and the scent of dust and old paper in the room faded, replaced by the smell of mud, cordite, and fear. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in moments of great stress. It wasn't of a firefight or a heroic charge. It was of a quiet, desperate moment in the suffocating humidity of a jungle clearing. A young private, a kid from Ohio named Miller with a picture of his high school sweetheart taped to his helmet, had stepped on a pressure plate. The resulting blast hadn't killed him, but it had shredded his leg and pinned him under a fallen banyan tree. They were cut off from their platoon, with enemy patrols sweeping the area. The order was to fall back to regroup. Leaving Miller was the logical, tactical choice. But Arthur, then a young sergeant, couldn't do it. He saw the sheer terror in the boy's eyes, the plea that was too raw to be spoken. While the others provided covering fire, Arthur had stayed with Miller. For 6 hours, under the constant threat of discovery, he lay beside the wounded boy in the mud, speaking to him in low, calm tones. He told him about his childhood in Nebraska, about learning to fish with his father, about the first time he'd seen Eleanor at a town dance. He used his own canteen to wet the boy's lips, his own field dressing to slow the bleeding. He did not fire his weapon. He did not shout commands. He simply stayed, a quiet, reassuring presence against the encroaching darkness. He had made a silent promise to that terrified boy, "You will not die alone." When reinforcements finally broke through, they found Arthur, exhausted and mud-caked, still holding Miller's hand. Miller survived. Arthur never spoke of it again. It wasn't a story for the bars or the VFW halls. It was a private, sacred thing. That was his brand of courage. Not the loud, boisterous kind, but the quiet, stubborn refusal to abandon his post, to break his word, to let another man down. He opened his eyes, the living room slowly coming back into focus. He looked at his own hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, and saw the same hands that had held Miller's. He had faced down enemy soldiers, debilitating loss, and the slow, grinding passage of time. He had survived it all. But this new enemy, this faceless, voiceless scammer and the cold indifference of men like Henderson, felt different. It was a battle fought not with rifles and grit, but against shame and invisibility. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Pendleton felt like he was losing. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, filtering through the thin curtains and painting the living room in shades of despair. Arthur hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in his armchair, a silent, lonely vigil. With the dawn came a sharp, authoritative rap on his front door. He knew what it was before he even saw it. He opened the door to an empty porch, but taped to the wood was a piece of paper. It was a lurid, fluorescent orange, a color designed to attract attention, to broadcast failure. In stark black letters, the words were a public condemnation. Notice of eviction, the official seal of the county court, seemed to mock him. He slowly peeled the notice from his door, the tape making a sickening, tearing sound. His hands shook so badly that the paper rattled. He felt a burning shame creep up his neck. This wasn't just a legal document. It was a brand. He was being marked as a deadbeat, a failure, a man unable to manage his own affairs, for the entire neighborhood to see. He quickly retreated inside, but it was too late. Across the street, Mrs. Gable was retrieving her morning paper. She saw him. Her eyes flickered from his face to the orange notice in his hand, and then she quickly looked away, a flicker of something, pity or perhaps distaste, crossing her features before she hurried back inside. A few minutes later, 2 men from down the block walked by on their morning jog. They slowed as they passed his house, their conversation dropping to a murmur. Arthur could feel their stares through his own front window. He was now a spectacle, a topic of neighborhood gossip. The quiet, respectable Mr. Pendleton was being evicted. The silence from his community was a suffocating blanket. No one knocked. No one called. The phone, which had been his instrument of ruin the day before, remained silent. Each car that drove past his house seemed to slow down, its occupants craning their necks to get a look at the house with the mark of shame. The pressure built inside him, a silent scream of humiliation and rage that had nowhere to go. He was trapped, not just in his house, but in his own powerlessness. He spent the rest of the day in a haze of grim activity. There was no point in denying the inevitable. He found a few flattened cardboard boxes in his small garage and began the heartbreaking process of dismantling his life. He carefully wrapped the framed photo of Eleanor in an old dish towel and placed it in a box. He packed his sparse collection of books, his fingers tracing the worn spines. When he came to the display case, he paused. He took out the medals, their weight feeling heavier than ever. He polished each one with a soft cloth, his movements slow and methodical. These objects represented a man of honor, of duty, of sacrifice. How could that man be the same one packing his life into cardboard boxes because he'd been tricked like a child? It didn't make sense. The world felt inverted, its values turned upside down. As he worked, the house grew emptier, the echoes of his movements louder. Each object he packed away was an amputation, a piece of his history being severed. This wasn't just a house. It was the home he and Eleanor had built together, the place where every scuff on the floor and crack in the plaster held a memory. Now, it was just a property, a line item on Henderson's balance sheet, and he was being forcibly excised from it. The sun began to set, casting the same long shadows as the day before, but tonight they felt colder, more permanent. He sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, a general surveying the wreckage of a lost battle. The world had rendered its judgment, and his neighbors were its silent jury. The next day was a carbon copy of the one before it, gray, silent, and heavy with unspoken judgment. Arthur sat on his porch steps, nursing a cup of coffee he couldn't taste, watching the world go by without him. He was trying to figure out his next move, but his mind was a fog of anxiety and defeat. Where would he go? What would he do? The questions were monumental, and he had no answers. Down the street, a young woman named Sarah was struggling to load groceries into her car while her daughter, a little girl of about 6 named Lily, played on the sidewalk with a small, scruffy terrier. The dog, named Patches, was a bundle of chaotic energy. Suddenly, Lily let out a small shriek of delight as she tossed a red ball. She threw it too far. The ball bounced off the curb and rolled into the street. Patches, in a frenzy of playful excitement, shot after it, oblivious to the world around him. At that exact moment, a blue sedan turned the corner, its driver distracted, looking down at a phone. The car wasn't speeding, but it was moving fast enough. Sarah screamed, dropping a bag of oranges that scattered across the driveway. Lily stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Time seemed to slow down. Arthur saw it all unfold in a series of distinct, horrifying frames. The dog in the road, the approaching car, the terrified child. In that instant, the crushing weight of his own problems, the eviction, the lost money, the humiliation evaporated. A lifetime of instinct took over. The instinct to protect, to act, to stand between innocence and harm. His body, old and aching, moved with a speed and purpose it hadn't known in decades. He launched himself off the porch steps, his bad knee screaming in protest. He didn't feel it. He covered the distance in a few desperate, lunging strides. He wasn't fast enough to get to the dog before the car. He had only one option. He shoved Lily back, a firm, protective push that sent her stumbling safely onto the grass of her lawn. Then, with no time to spare, he dove, his arms outstretched, scooping the wriggling body of the terrier into his chest just as the car screeched to a halt, its bumper inches from his head. The impact of his dive wasn't with the car, but with the rough, unforgiving asphalt of the street. Pain exploded in his shoulder and hip as he rolled, his body instinctively curling around the small dog to shield it from harm. He came to a stop in a heap, his hands and knees scraped raw, the warm, terrified body of Patches trembling against his chest. The driver of the car, a young man with a pale, shocked face, was stammering apologies. Sarah was already there, kneeling beside him, her hands fluttering, unsure of what to do. "Are you okay? Oh my God. Are you okay, Mr. Pendleton?" Lily was crying, a mixture of fear and relief. Patches, unharmed, began licking Arthur's face. Arthur just lay there for a moment, the world swimming back into focus. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his whole body protesting. He handed the trembling dog to Lily, who hugged it tightly. "He's all right," Arthur said, his voice raspy. He looked at his hands. They were bleeding, gravel embedded in his palms. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his knee. But as he looked at the little girl, now safely reunited with her pet, none of it mattered. He had acted. In a world that had rendered him powerless, he had found a moment where he could make a difference. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet, waving off Sarah's frantic offers to call an ambulance. "I'm fine," he insisted, though every joint ached. Just a few scrapes. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply gave a small nod, turned, and limped back toward his own house, his own problems, his own quiet despair. His dignity was the one thing the scammer and the landlord couldn't take from him, and in that single, selfless act, it was the only thing he had left to give. Sarah watched Arthur Pendleton limp back to his house, his shoulders slightly stooped, his gait stiff with pain. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, her daughter sobbing quietly into the fur of her rescued dog, the scattered oranges from her dropped grocery bag a bright, forgotten constellation on the pavement. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat of leftover adrenaline and a new, powerful emotion. Shame. She had seen the eviction notice. She had heard the whispers. She, like everyone else on the street, had silently labeled Mr. Pendleton. He was the reclusive old man, the one whose house needed a coat of paint, the one who was now, apparently, unable to pay his bills. He was a problem, an object of pity, a cautionary tale. She had looked at him and seen failure. But what she had just witnessed was not failure. It was heroism, pure and simple. It was the kind of instinctive, selfless courage people made movies about. An old man, facing his own profound crisis, a man who had every right to be consumed by his own misery, had thrown himself into the path of danger to save her daughter's dog. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't weighed the risks. He had simply acted. The image of him rolling on the asphalt, his body curled around the little terrier, was seared into her mind. The quiet way he had handed the dog back and limped away without a word of complaint or a demand for thanks was even more powerful. Later that afternoon, Sarah gathered up the scattered oranges and went back inside, but she couldn't shake the feeling of profound unease. Her own inaction, her silent judgment, felt like a betrayal. She picked up the phone and called her neighbor across the street. "Carol, did you see what happened this morning?" she began, her voice still trembling slightly. "With Mr. Pendleton?" "I saw the commotion," Carol said. "Is he all right?" Sarah recounted the entire event, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and guilt. "He saved Patches, Carol. He could have been seriously hurt, and we've all just been watching. We saw that notice on his door and we did nothing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I know," Carol admitted, her voice softer now. "My husband said he saw him at the bank the other day, looking terribly upset. We just assumed." Well, the narrative on Oak Street began to change. Not with a shout, but with a series of quiet phone calls and conversations over backyard fences. Sarah's story spread like a slow-burning fire. The whispers of judgment were replaced by whispers of respect. The mailman, who had seen Arthur dive, mentioned it to Mrs. Gable. She, in turn, recalled how Mr. Pendleton had spent 3 hours in a blizzard last winter shoveling not just his own walk, but hers and the elderly couple's next door, never asking for a thing in return. Another neighbor remembered that Arthur was a veteran. "I think he was in Vietnam," he told his wife. "Saw some medals in his window once." Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle that was Arthur Pendleton started to form a different picture. The quiet old man wasn't antisocial. He was reserved. He wasn't a deadbeat. He was a victim. He wasn't a failure. He was a man of quiet, profound dignity who had just performed an act of incredible bravery while his own world was collapsing. The shame Sarah felt began to ripple through the community. They had failed him. They had stood by in silent judgment while a good man suffered, and it had taken his own selfless action in the face of that suffering to make them see who he truly was. The orange eviction notice was still a blight on his front door, but it no longer signified his failure. Now it signified theirs. The sun rose the next morning with a fragile golden light, promising a day of warmth and calm. But the peace of Oak Street was about to be shattered. It began not as a sight, but as a sound. A low, guttural rumble, so deep it seemed to vibrate up from the pavement itself. At first, it was distant, a faint tremor on the edge of hearing, easily mistaken for a passing freight train or distant thunder. But it didn't fade. It grew. The rumble became a a rolling, percussive wave of sound that washed over the quiet suburban houses, rattling window panes and setting dogs to barking. Residents emerged onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, their faces etched with confusion and alarm. They looked up and down the street, searching for the source of the mechanical symphony. Then they saw them. Turning onto the street from the main road was a river of steel, chrome, and black leather. A seemingly endless procession of Harley-Davidson motorcycles, their engines thundering in a disciplined, intimidating rhythm. They moved not like a chaotic gang, but like a cavalry unit, precise and purposeful. One by one, they peeled off, parking with practiced efficiency, forming two perfect, menacing lines that flanked Arthur's driveway, their headlights like the eyes of predatory animals. The sheer number was overwhelming. 10, then 20, then 50, until the count swelled to an unbelievable 90 bikes. The street was choked with them. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust and hot metal. The bikers dismounted in near unison. They were a legion of leather and denim, their vests adorned with the iconic, fearsome insignia of the Hells Angels. They were large men, weathered and bearded, their faces hard and unreadable. They moved with a quiet confidence that radiated power and an implicit threat. The engines cut out one by one, and the sudden, profound silence that fell over the street was more terrifying than the noise had been. Neighbors who had been standing on their lawns slowly backed away, retreating behind the safety of their front doors to peek through curtains and blinds. This was an invasion. It was something from the news, not something that happened on their quiet, manicured street. At the head of the formation, a man who was larger than the rest swung his leg over his bike. He was built like a mountain, with a thick, graying beard that covered most of his chest and arms corded with muscle and faded tattoos. A patch on his vest read Sarge. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, his heavy boots sounding like drumbeats on the asphalt. He didn't look at the twitching curtains or the frightened faces. His eyes were fixed on one place, Arthur Pendleton's small, unassuming house, with the ugly orange notice still taped to the door. Sarge walked to the bottom of Arthur's porch steps, the other 89 angels standing behind him, a silent, unmoving army. He didn't go up the steps. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, a silent, imposing sentinel, and waited. The message was clear. They weren't here to ask for anything. They were here to make a statement. The balance of power on Oak Street had just shifted, completely and irrevocably. Sarge stood motionless at the foot of the steps, a granite statue of leather and denim. The silence on the street was thick with tension. Doors remained closed, curtains stayed drawn. The neighborhood held its collective breath. Then one door opened. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. She had seen the bikers arrive, had felt the same fear as everyone else, but the guilt from the day before was a stronger force. She walked out of her house, across her lawn, and stepped into the street, placing herself directly in the unnerving space between her world and theirs. She stopped a few feet from Sarge, her hands clasped in front of her. "Are you here for Mr. Pendleton?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. Sarge's eyes, chips of cold blue steel, shifted to her. He didn't answer, just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Emboldened, Sarah took a breath and the words tumbled out. She told him about the dog, the car, the way Arthur had moved without a thought for himself. "He saved my daughter's dog," she finished, her voice thick with emotion. "He's a good man. He doesn't deserve what's happening to him." As she spoke, another figure emerged from the silent ranks of the bikers. He was younger than most, his face clean-shaven, his eyes carrying a different kind of weight. He walked up to stand beside Sarge. He looked at Sarah, then at Arthur's front door. "He's more than a good man," the younger biker said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. He turned to his leader. "Sarge, that man in there. That's Sergeant Pendleton." A murmur went through the ranks. The name meant something. The younger biker, whose vest identified him as Miller, looked back at the house, his expression one of deep, profound reverence. "We were in the jungle outside of Kisan," Miller began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, not just to Sarge, but to the entire assembled chapter. We got ambushed, cut off. I stepped on a mine, took my leg. I was pinned down, bleeding out. The order was to fall back. They were going to leave me, he paused, swallowing hard. But he didn't. Sergeant Pendleton, he stayed with me. For 6 hours, he lay in the mud beside me while the enemy was all around us. He didn't fight. He just stayed. He talked to me. He kept me from giving up. He saved my life. Miller's gaze swept over the stunned faces of his brothers. Everything I have, my wife, my kids, this club, this life, I owe to him. I tried to find him for years after I got back stateside, but he just disappeared. Lived a quiet life. Never asked for a thing. He then turned his attention to the orange notice on the door, his eyes hardening with a cold fury. And some coward on a telephone, some spineless thief, did this to him. They didn't just steal his money. They disrespected him. They disrespected the very idea of honor that this man's entire life has been about. The truth settled over the street, more powerful than the roar of their engines. A few more neighbors, emboldened by Sarah, had crept out onto their lawns. They heard it all. The man they had pitied, the man they had judged, was a decorated war hero. The quiet old man who shoveled their snow and saved their pets had once held a dying boy's hand in a jungle halfway around the world. The scam was no longer a simple crime of theft. It was an act of sacrilege. It was a stain on a code of honor that every man standing in that street understood in his very bones. Sarge looked from Miller to the front door of the house. His expression hadn't changed, but a new light burned in his eyes. This was no longer just about helping a vulnerable old man. This was about restoring the honor of a brother. Sarge finally moved. He walked up the 3 wooden steps of the porch, his boots making a heavy, definitive sound. He didn't knock with his knuckles. He balled his hand into a fist and struck the door 3 times, a sound like a judge's gavel. A moment later, the door creaked open. Arthur Pendleton stood there, his face etched with confusion and weariness. He looked smaller than he had on the street, framed by the dark interior of his home. His eyes widened as he took in the sight. The mountain of a man on his porch, and beyond him, the impossible sea of bikers and chrome that had consumed his entire street. He was bewildered, perhaps a little frightened. Sarge looked down at Arthur, his hard expression softening almost imperceptibly. He reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He didn't offer a long speech or a comforting platitude. His words were simple, direct, and freighted with meaning. "From the boys," he grunted, pressing the envelope into Arthur's hand. A debt repaid. Arthur looked down at the envelope, then back at Sarge, speechless. He could feel the thickness of the cash inside. It was far more than his rent. Before Arthur could process this, the bikers began to move. They broke from their silent formation with a quiet, disciplined energy. A team of 4, led by Miller, got back on their bikes and roared away down the street, their destination unspoken but understood. Mr. Henderson's property management office was about to receive some new tenants for a conversation. The rest of the bikers descended upon Arthur's property like a highly efficient work crew. Several men pulled lawnmowers and weed whackers from a support truck that had quietly pulled up at the end of the block. They started on the overgrown lawn, the roar of small engines replacing the thunder of the Harleys. Another group, carrying tool belts and lumber, immediately began assessing the rickety, peeling fence. Within minutes, the sound of hammers striking nails echoed through the neighborhood. A team of painters materialized with brushes, rollers, and cans of white paint, and began scraping the old, flaking paint from his porch railings. They moved with a shared purpose, a silent communication passing between them. They were not just doing chores, they were performing a ritual. They were restoring a perimeter, fortifying a sanctuary, erasing the visible signs of neglect and hardship that had made Arthur a target. Sometime later, a car came screeching down the street and slammed to a halt. A pale, sweating Mr. Henderson scrambled out. He looked wildly from the bikers working on the lawn to the imposing figures on the porch, his face a mask of pure terror. He scurried up to the house, clutching a piece of paper. He didn't even look at Arthur. He went straight to the orange eviction notice, tore it from the door with trembling hands, and then ripped it into tiny, frantic pieces, letting them scatter like confetti on the porch. "A misunderstanding," he stammered, his eyes darting around nervously. "A clerical error. Please, tell your friends. It's all been sorted out." He practically ran back to his car and sped away. As the day wore on, the transformation was astonishing. The lawn was manicured, the fence was repaired and sturdy, and the porch gleamed with a fresh coat of paint. The community, watching this incredible spectacle unfold, finally broke its paralysis. Sarah appeared with a large tray of sandwiches. Mrs. Gable brought out a cooler full of bottled water. Soon, other neighbors followed, offering coffee, donuts, and quiet words of thanks to the intimidating men who were doing the work they themselves should have done. By late afternoon, the work was done. Sarge called Miller over. Miller was carrying a folded piece of black leather. He handed it to Sarge, who turned back to Arthur. He unfolded it. It was a brand new leather vest, just like the ones the bikers wore, but with one crucial difference. The back was clean, bearing no club patches. Instead, it was emblazoned with a large, beautifully stitched American flag, and beneath it, the insignia of Arthur's old army unit. "You don't ride with us," Sarge said, his voice a low rumble of respect. "But you are one of us." He held the vest out to Arthur. It was not a gift. It was an induction, a recognition, a shield. It was a symbol that he was no longer alone. He was under their protection. Arthur stood on his newly painted porch, the late afternoon sun warm on his face. He ran his hand over the soft, supple leather of the vest Sarge had given him. It felt heavy, substantial, a tangible armor against the invisibility he had felt just yesterday. He was no longer a forgotten old man in a decaying house. He was a sentinel, a respected elder standing guard over a home that had been reclaimed and restored by an unlikely brotherhood. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of awe and contemplation. His neighbors, who had once averted their eyes, now stood on their lawns or porches, watching. Their faces held a mixture of emotions: shame for their earlier judgment, gratitude for the bikers' intervention, and a newfound, profound respect for the man who lived at 214 Oak Street. The bikers began to mount their motorcycles, the process as disciplined as their arrival. The click of kickstands, the creak of leather, the soft thud of boots on pavement. It was a quiet, preparatory ritual. Miller walked up to the porch one last time. He stopped before Arthur and simply rendered a sharp, perfect military salute. Arthur, his back straight, his shoulders square, returned it without hesitation. For a moment, they were not a biker and an old man. They were two soldiers, two survivors, acknowledging a shared history and an unbreakable bond of honor across the decades. "If you need anything, Sergeant," Miller said, his voice low, "anything at all, you know who to call." Arthur simply nodded, his throat too thick with emotion to speak. Sarge was the last to mount his bike. He straddled the powerful machine and looked at Arthur, who was now standing taller than he had in years. Sarge didn't smile, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound respect from one leader to another. Arthur returned the nod. Then, with a single, unified roar, 90 engines exploded to life. The sound was deafening, a thunderous, triumphant salute that shook the very foundations of the houses. It wasn't a sound of menace anymore. It was a declaration. It was the sound of loyalty, of honor, of a promise kept. They pulled out one by one, a chrome and leather parade, and thundered off down the street, leaving behind the clean scent of fresh paint, manicured grass, and a community forever changed. As the last of the engine noise faded into the distance, a profound peace settled over the street. Arthur remained on his porch, the vest a warm weight on his shoulders. He looked at his home, no longer a prison of shame but a fortress of dignity. He looked at his neighbors, who were now approaching, not with pity, but with offers of friendship and plates of food. He looked inside through his clean window at the polished mahogany case on his mantelpiece. The setting sun struck the glass at just the right angle, and for a fleeting moment, his silver star and purple heart seemed to gleam with a renewed light, their silent testimony finally heard. Arthur Pendleton was home, and he was not alone. The quiet dignity he had carried his entire life had finally been met with a response as loud and powerful as a legion of angels on iron horses.